Margaret Sullivan pressed her face against the grimy train window, watching the endless expanse of brown hills roll past like waves of dried earth. Her 7-year-old son Tommy slept fitfully against her shoulder, while 4-year-old Lucy clutched a threadbare doll, wide eyes drinking in the foreign landscape. The letter from Thomas Whitmore crinkled in Margaret's sweaty palm. 3 months of correspondence promising a new life, a father for her children, a home at Dry Creek Station. She whispered a prayer that this stranger would be kinder than the Boston streets that had nearly claimed them all. The conductor's weathered face appeared in the doorway, his voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter of wheels. Dry Creek Station. Next stop. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered their meager possessions to carpet bags and a wooden crate containing everything they owned. Tommy stirred awake, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Are we there, Mama? Will the new papa be waiting?" Lucy pressed her small hand against the window, searching for any sign of civilization in the vast emptiness. Margaret smoothed her worn dress and tried to project confidence. She didn't feel that. The train shuddered to a halt with a screech of brakes and hiss of steam. Through the settling dust, Margaret saw only a weathered platform and a single wooden building that looked abandoned. No bustling station, no waiting figure, no sign of the prosperous town Thomas had described in his letters. Her stomach dropped as she helped the children down the train steps, their small feet hitting the dusty platform with hollow sounds. The conductor tipped his hat and climbed back aboard, leaving them standing alone as the train pulled away with a lonesome whistle that echoed across the empty hills. Margaret pushed open the station house door, calling out hopefully, "Mr. Whitmore." Thomas' dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through broken windows. The building was empty except for a rickety desk covered in old papers and a telegraph key that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Her hands trembled as she searched through the scattered documents, finding nothing but bills of sale from a year ago and a final notice of abandonment. The devastating truth crashed over her like a cold wave. There was no Thomas Whitmore, no marriage, no new beginning. She had been deceived, lured across the country by a cruel hoax. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Tommy tugged at her skirt with worried eyes. "Mama, where is everybody? Where's our new house?" Margaret's throat closed as she looked at her children's trusting faces. Then, at their remaining coins, barely enough for a meal, certainly not enough for return passage to Boston, Lucy began to cry softly, sensing the tension without understanding it. Outside, the wind rattled loose boards and tumbleweeds rolled past like nature's mockery of their situation. Margaret sank onto the dusty floor, pulling both children close, wondering how she would explain that their dreams had just turned to ashdot. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Margaret's head snap up. Through the cracked window, she saw a weathered man on horseback pause at the platform, studying the abandoned luggage. He dismounted slowly, his boots creating small dust clouds with each step. Margaret quickly wiped her tears and straightened her shoulders. Whatever came next, she would face it with dignity. The stranger's knock on the doorframe was gentle but firm. "Hello." Saw the train stop. "Everything all right in there?" His voice carried genuine concern, not threat. Margaret took a deep breath and opened the door to face their uncertain future. Sheriff Ben Morrison removed his hat as he took in the sight of the exhausted mother and two wide-eyed children surrounded by their belongings. His weathered face, lined by years of prairie sun, softened with understanding rather than suspicion. "You folks look like you're in a bit of trouble," he said gently, crouching to Tommy's eye level. Margaret found her voice, though it cracked with strain. "We were supposed to meet someone here, Thomas Whitmore, but ... She gestured helplessly at the empty station. Ben's expression darkened with recognition. "Whitmore, you say? Ma'am, I'm afraid you've been had. That name's been used to trick several women over the past year." Margaret's knees nearly buckled at the confirmation of her worst fears, but she forced herself to remain standing. "Sheriff, I won't ask for charity. My children and I will find a way." Ben studied her determined expression, seeing the same stubborn pride that had built this harsh country. "Mrs. Sullivan, Margaret Sullivan." He nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Sullivan, the nearest town is Millbrook, about 8 miles south, but it's getting late, and these hills aren't safe for walking after dark." Margaret looked at her exhausted children, then back at this kind stranger. "I suppose we don't have much choice but to accept help." It was the hardest thing she'd ever said, but perhaps the most important. Ben lifted their bags with practiced ease, while Margaret gathered the children. My wife Clara runs a boarding house in Millbrook. She'll have supper ready in warm beds. Tommy walked beside the sheriff's horse, peppering him with questions about the vast landscape, while Lucy remained close to her mother. The 8 journey stretched before them like a passage between worlds, leaving behind their shattered dreams of Dry Creek Station and moving toward an uncertain future in a town they'd never heard of. Margaret's feet ached in her thin boots, but each step felt like a small act of courage as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The outline of Millbrook emerged from the rolling hills. Margaret counted perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a main street, a modest settlement that seemed to breathe with quiet life. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the warm glow of oil lamps began to appear in windows. Children played in dusty yards, while women gathered at garden gates for evening conversations. It looked nothing like the bustling town Thomas Whitmore had promised, but there was something welcoming about its humble authenticity that made Margaret's heart lift slightly. Clara Morrison stood on the porch of her white-painted boarding house, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron as she watched the approaching group. Her round face lit up with instant warmth when she saw the children, and she hurried down the steps with arms already opening. "Ben Morrison, you didn't tell me you were bringing us angels," she called out, immediately enveloping Lucy in a soft embrace that smelled of fresh bread and lavender soap. Tommy hung back shyly until Clara ruffled his hair with gentle affection. "Come now, children. I've got chicken stew keeping warm and apple pie cooling on the windowsill." As they crossed the threshold of the Morrison boarding house, Margaret felt the weight of the day's disasters begin to lift from her shoulders. The main room glowed with lamplight and the warmth of a well-tended fire. Other boarders nodded friendly greetings while Clara fussed over the children, already setting out bowls and cutting thick slices of bread. Ben caught Margaret's eye and nodded toward a quiet corner where they could talk. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said gently, "tomorrow we'll figure out what's to be done. Tonight, you're safe." For the first time since stepping off that train, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. Morning light streamed through gingham curtains as Margaret woke to the sound of her children's laughter drifting up from the dining room below. She had slept better than she had in months, wrapped in Clara's handmade quilt, and surrounded by the peaceful sounds of a home filled with contentment. Downstairs, she found Tommy helping Clara gather eggs, while Lucy carefully set spoons around the large wooden table. The other boarders, a traveling salesman, an elderly teacher, and a young couple, made room for her with easy acceptance. Clara pressed a cup of strong coffee into her hands and asked no questions about their circumstances. After breakfast, Ben walked Margaret down Millbrook's main street, introducing her to the townspeople with matter-of-fact kindness that made no mention of their desperate arrival. Dr. Samuel Hayes, a gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes, examined both children and declared them healthy but in need of regular meals. Martha Calloway, who ran the general store with her husband, immediately offered Lucy a stick of peppermint candy and asked if Margaret had any experience with numbers. Their bookkeeper had recently moved away. Each encounter felt like a small door opening, revealing possibilities Margaret hadn't dared to imagine. The local schoolmaster, Professor William Chung, was teaching his mixed-age class of 12 children when Ben and Margaret appeared in the doorway. His face brightened as he observed Tommy and Lucy peeking curiously at the students bent over their slates. "We always have room for eager young minds," he said, kneeling to speak with Tommy about his reading level. The children in the classroom turned with curious but friendly faces, and Margaret noticed how Professor Chen had created an atmosphere of genuine learning despite the modest one-room schoolhouse. Lucy whispered that she wanted to learn to write her name properly, and the professor's smile made it seem like the most important request in the world. At the Calloway General Store, Margaret's careful arithmetic and neat handwriting impressed both Martha and her husband Jim. "We've been trying to manage the books ourselves," Martha confided, "but it's clear we need someone with a proper education." She showed Margaret the account ledgers, filled with Jim's cramped handwriting and smudged calculations. The work would be part-time but regular, providing enough income for basic necessities. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she accepted the position. It was the first time in months she'd felt capable rather than desperate. Martha squeezed her shoulder with understanding warmth. That evening at Clara's dinner table, the conversation naturally turned to the Sullivans' situation. Margaret tried to explain their circumstances without revealing too much of her shame. but her voice caught when she mentioned the cruel deception that had brought them west. The elderly teacher, Miss Adelaide Porter, reached across the table to pat Margaret's hand. "My dear, every one of us has a story of how we ended up in Millbrook. Most of us didn't expect to stay, but the town has a way of growing on folks." The young couple, newly married homesteaders, nodded in agreement. Sometimes the best things happen when life doesn't go according to plan. Later that night, as Margaret tucked her children into the comfortable beds Clara had prepared, Tommy looked up with serious eyes. "Mama, I like it here. The people are nice, and Professor Chen says I'm smart enough for advanced arithmetic." Lucy, already half asleep, mumbled her agreement while clutching her doll close. Margaret sat on the edge of Tommy's bed, stroking his dark hair. "You know what, sweetheart? I think I like it here too." The words surprised her with their truth. For the first time since her husband's death, she could imagine building something real and lasting. These people had shown them more kindness in one day than Bofton had offered in 2 years of struggle. Margaret's first week at the general store revealed the intricate web of relationships that kept Millbrook functioning. Every transaction told a story: the widow who traded eggs for flour, the young father who worked extra hours at the mill to buy fabric for his wife's new dress, the elderly couple who helped their neighbors despite their own limited means. Martha taught her the unspoken rules of frontier commerce: when to extend credit, when to accept unusual forms of payment, and when to quietly provide necessities to families facing hard times. Margaret began to understand that she wasn't just keeping books, she was helping to maintain the community's delicate balance of mutual support. The children adapted to their new routine with the resilience that had helped them survive harsh streets. Tommy excelled in his studies under Professor Chen's patient guidance, while Lucy blossomed in the attention of the other students who took turns helping her with letters and numbers. Margaret watched from the store window as her daughter played hopscotch with children who accepted her without question or judgment. During lunch breaks, Tommy would run errands for various townspeople, earning small coins that he proudly presented to his mother each evening. Their integration into the community's daily rhythms felt natural and right. 3 weeks into their stay, Margaret received an unexpected visitor at the store. A well-dressed man from the county office had arrived to investigate reports of the Dry Creek Station mail fraud scheme. Agent Harrison was thorough but kind, listening carefully as Margaret described the correspondence and promises that had lured her west. "You're the 4th woman we know of," he revealed grimly. "The perpetrators have been targeting widows and single mothers, specifically those in desperate circumstances." Margaret's face burned with shame at how easily she'd been deceived, but Agent Harrison's professional compassion made her feel more like a victim seeking justice than a fool who'd been tricked. The investigation brought uncomfortable attention to Margaret's situation, but it also revealed the depth of Mill's protective instincts toward its adopted family. When word spread about the fraud scheme, several townspeople quietly approached Margaret with offers of more permanent help. Reverend Mitchell suggested the church could provide a small cottage behind the parsonage in exchange for Margaret helping with Sunday school and church records. Dr. Hayes mentioned that his wife had been looking for someone to help with their growing medical practice, someone educated enough to assist with correspondence and patient records. One evening as autumn painted the hills in brilliant reds and golds, Margaret found herself at the center of an impromptu town meeting in Clara's dining room. What had started as casual dinner conversation about winter preparations had evolved into a serious discussion about the Sullivans' future. Martha Kellaway spoke first. "Margaret's become indispensable at the store. I can't imagine managing without her now." Professor Chen added that both children were among his brightest students and natural leaders who helped create a positive learning environment. Even the traveling salesman, who visited monthly, mentioned that his business dealings were more pleasant since Margaret had been keeping the store's accounts in perfect order. Ben Morrison, who had been quietly listening, finally stood and addressed the room with the authority of his office but the warmth of a friend. "Folks, it seems to me we're dancing around something that's already been decided. The Sullivans belong here, and we belong to each other. The question isn't whether they should stay, it's how we're going to make sure they can." Clara beamed from the kitchen doorway while Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. The acceptance was overwhelming, almost too good to believe. These people were offering not just help, but true belonging. The peaceful progress of their integration was shattered when Agent Harrison returned with disturbing news. The mail fraud investigation had uncovered something more sinister. Thomas Whitmore was actually Theodore Walsh, a man with a criminal history who had been luring women west, not just for money, but to sell them into dangerous situations in mining camps and rough frontier towns. Mrs. Sullivan, Harrison said gravely, we have reason to believe Walsh may still be operating in this region. He might try to find you, thinking you have information that could implicate him. The blood drained from Margaret's face as she realized their sanctuary might not be as safe as it seemed. The threat to Margaret and her children galvanized Millbrook in ways that surprised even its longtime residents. Ben Morrison immediately organized a protection schedule, with various men taking turns to ensure someone was always watching the boarding house and the general store. Dr. Hayes is offered to examine Walsh's photograph for any signs of disguise or alteration that might help identify him if he appeared. Professor Chen quietly arranged for Tommy and Lucy to stay close to the schoolhouse during recess, while Martha Kellaway installed better locks on the store and made sure Margaret was never alone during business hours. The communal response to danger revealed something profound about Millbrook's character. Margaret had expected fear and possibly suggestions that she should leave to protect the town from trouble. Instead, she found determination and fierce protectiveness. Miss Adelaide Porter, despite her 70 years, took to carrying her late father's pistol and positioned herself strategically during Margaret's work hours. The young homesteading couple volunteered to take shifts, watching the approaches to town. Even Clara, usually focused on domestic concerns, began asking pointed questions about strangers who inquired about lodging. As winter approached, the town's protective embrace became even more evident in small, daily actions. Firewood appeared at the boarding house without anyone taking credit. Extra food found its way into Clara's kitchen with notes saying it was for the children. Margaret discovered that someone had quietly paid her account at the general store in advance, and when she tried to investigate, Martha just smiled and said it was community business. The kindness was so consistent and quietly coordinated that Margaret began to understand she was experiencing something beyond individual charity. She was witnessing how a true community cared for its own. One snowy evening in December, Margaret was closing the store when she noticed a stranger watching from across the street. Her blood turned cold as she recognized features that matched Agent Harrison's description of Theodore Walsh. He was thinner than she'd expected, with mean eyes that seemed to catalog weaknesses and opportunities. Margaret forced herself to continue her routine while her heart hammered against her ribs. She locked the store carefully and walked toward the boarding house at her normal pace. Knowing that Ben Morrison would be making his evening rounds soon, the stranger followed at a distance. Confirming her worst fears, Ben Morrison materialized from the shadows as if he'd been waiting, his hand resting casually but visibly on his gun belt. "Evening, Mrs. Sullivan," he said loudly enough for the stranger to hear. "I'll walk you home. Been having reports of suspicious characters in the area." The stranger melted back into the darkness, but Margaret knew he hadn't gone far. Back at Clara's, Ben revealed that the town had been quietly prepared for this possibility for weeks. Agent Harrison sent word that Walsh had been spotted 2 towns over. "We've been ready." Margaret realized that while she'd been worrying about their safety, the entire community had been standing guard. The next morning brought devastating news that changed everything. Agent Harrison arrived with a federal marshal and grim expressions. Theodore Walsh had been found dead in a hotel room 2 towns over, apparently killed by one of his criminal associates in a dispute over money. While Margaret felt relief at the end of the immediate threat, the marshal brought disturbing information. Walsh had been carrying detailed notes about Millbrook, including sketches of the main street and specific mentions of Margaret and her children. "He was planning something here," the marshal explained. "We may never know exactly what, but you were definitely his target." The revelation that Margaret and her children had been specifically hunted by a dangerous criminal sent shockwaves through Millbrook's quiet community, but rather than fear or resentment, the townspeople responded with an even deeper sense of protective unity. Town meetings that winter focused not on asking the Sullivans to leave for everyone's safety, but on how to strengthen their collective security. New communication systems were established. Better lighting was installed on the main street, and residents began coordinating more closely with county law enforcement. Margaret realized that instead of being seen as the cause of danger, she was viewed as someone worth defending. Spring's arrival brought a sense of renewal and permanent settling that Margaret had never expected to experience again. The cottage behind Reverend Mitchell's church had been quietly prepared throughout the winter, with contributions of furniture, linens, and household goods from every family in town. Dr. Hayes had formally offered her a position helping with his medical practice, which would combine with her store work to provide steady income. Professor Chen had arranged for both children to participate in a regional academic competition, proud of their achievements and confident in their abilities. One evening in late April, as Margaret sat in Clara's parlor mending Tommy's school shirt, she was struck by a moment of overwhelming emotion that took her completely by surprise. The comfortable sounds of domestic life surrounded her. Clara, humming in the kitchen, the other boarders reading and conversing quietly, her children playing checkers by the fireplace. The simple peace of the scene made her realize how completely her life had been transformed. She began to cry, not from sadness but from the profound relief of finally feeling safe and loved. Clara appeared instantly with a cup of tea and knowing smile. "It hits all of us eventually, dear. The moment when we realize we're truly home." Margaret's tears that evening marked a turning point that everyone in the boarding house seemed to understand without explanation. The next morning, Clara quietly suggested that it might be time to begin planning the move to the cottage. Not as a necessity but as a natural progression. The children were excited about having their own space, and Margaret found herself thinking about curtains and garden plots instead of escape routes and survival strategies. Ben Morrison stopped by with legal papers that would formally establish her residency and give her full rights as a citizen of the territory. The bureaucratic details felt like sacred ceremony, official recognition of what her heart already knew. The cottage behind the church was larger than Margaret had expected, with 2 small bedrooms, a main room with a fireplace, and a kitchen that opened onto a plot perfect for a vegetable garden. Someone had installed new windows that filled the space with morning light, and the floors had been carefully repaired and polished. Tommy ran from room to room, planning where his books would go, while Lucy claimed the corner by the kitchen window for her doll's house. Margaret stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the generous preparation that had made this possible. Every detail spoke of careful thought and genuine affection. Moving day became an impromptu celebration that drew nearly the entire town. Families brought covered dishes and made it a community picnic, with the furniture carrying, interspersed with games for the children, and music from Professor Chen's violin. Martha Kellaway presented Margaret with a set of account books, specially prepared for managing household expenses, while Dr. Hayes arrived with a complete medical kit in case of emergencies. Miss Adelaide Porter contributed a small library of books she thought the children should have, and Clara brought a rocking chair that had belonged to her grandmother. Each gift carried the weight of acceptance and the promise of permanence. As evening approached and the celebration wound down, Margaret found herself standing in her new garden with Tommy and Lucy, watching the sun set over the hills that no longer seemed foreign and threatening. The children were exhausted but glowing with excitement about their new home. Tommy looked up at his mother with serious eyes. "Mama, are we going to stay here forever?" Margaret knelt to embrace both children, breathing in the sweet scent of the wildflowers that grew along the cottage fence. "Yes, sweetheart, we're home." The word felt solid and true in her mouth, not a hope or a wish, but a simple fact. The final test of Margaret's transformation came that autumn, when Agent Harrison returned with news that completely reframed her understanding of their journey. His investigation had revealed that the mail fraud scheme had been carefully designed to target women with specific qualifications and ambition, strong character, and children who could adapt to frontier life. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said gently, "I believe you were selected not as a victim, but as someone who could contribute meaningfully to a developing community. Walsh may have been a criminal, but his partners included legitimate businessmen looking to attract suitable settlers to growing towns." Margaret stared at him in amazement, realizing that what she'd experienced as cruel deception might have been, in some twisted way, the mechanism that brought her exactly where she needed to be. The revelation changed nothing about Margaret's daily life but everything about her understanding of her story. She had not been rescued by Millbrook, she had been delivered to it. The town had not saved her from disaster, they had helped her fulfill her potential. That understanding gave her the confidence to accept Reverend Mitchell's request that she take over the church's correspondence with regional missions, and to agree to Dr. Hayes' suggestion that she begin training as a medical assistant. Her children were already being talked about as future leaders of the community. Margaret's transformation from desperate refugee to respected citizen was complete. Winter's return brought the first anniversary of their arrival in Millbrook. and Clara Morrison organized a quiet celebration at the boarding house. The same people who had welcomed 3 desperate strangers now toasted a beloved neighbor and her accomplished children. Tommy had become Professor Chun's unofficial assistant, helping younger students with their arithmetic. Lucy's bright personality had made her everyone's favorite, and she moved through the community with the confidence of a child who had never known rejection. Margaret looked around the familiar faces and realized that every one of these people was now family in the truest sense of the word. Spring brought official recognition of what had already been true for months. Margaret was elected to the school board and asked to represent Millbrook at the territorial capital regarding educational funding. Her children were among the top students in Professor Chen's school, and her work with Dr. Hayes had earned her recognition as one of the most competent medical assistants in the region. The cottage had been expanded with a small office where she could manage her various responsibilities. Their integration into Millbrook was so complete that visitors often assumed the Sullivans were founding family members. In many ways, they were. On a warm evening in May, exactly 2 years after their desperate arrival at Dry Creek Station, Margaret sat on her front porch watching Tommy and Lucy play with the other children in the churchyard. Clara Morrison approached with 2 cups of coffee and settled into the second rocking chair that had appeared on the porch without explanation or fanfare. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if that train had actually taken you where you thought you were going?" Clara asked gently. Margaret considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I think Thomas Whitmore did me the greatest favor of my life by not existing." The conversation drifted to practical matters: plans for the summer garden, preparations for the harvest festival, Tommy's accelerated studies that might qualify him for territorial college by age 16. But underneath the ordinary concerns of daily life ran a deeper current of contentment that Margaret had never expected to experience. Her children were thriving in ways that would have been impossible in Bofton's harsh anonymity. She had found work that used her abilities and contributed meaningfully to her community. Most importantly, she had discovered that family could be chosen and built, not just inherited or married into. As the evening star appeared above the hills and the children's laughter echoed across the peaceful settlement, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. She had set out seeking security through marriage to a stranger, and had instead found belonging through connection to an entire community. The deception that had seemed like her downfall had actually been her salvation. Sometimes, she realized, the most important destinations are the ones we never intended to reach. Sometimes the family we need is waiting in places we never thought to look. And sometimes the greatest gift life can offer is not getting what we think we want, but discovering what we truly need. The prairie wind carried the scent of growing things and the promise of tomorrow. And Margaret Sullivan smiled, knowing that she was finally, completely, home.